pharmaceutical drugs have some amazing benefits, and they've been incredible for mankind in so many different ways. The problem is unchecked capitalism.
So today I want to talk about whether or not we have unfettered, unregulated capitalism here in America, because last year I ended my year. I did a year in review on a year of unfettered, unregulated capitalism. And here's the thing, is there's a lot of people out there who still talk as if we have unfettered, unregulated capitalism, one of them being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In fact, I have a sound drop on my soundboard of this.
Right now, when we have this no-holds-barred, Wild West hyper-capitalism.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
But it's not just AOC, it's Bernie Sanders, who tweeted earlier this year on May 13th, unfettered capitalism. Is Jeff Bezos buying a $500 million super yacht, blah, 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 blah. I think AOC retweeted this, so she's essentially agreeing with this. Also, Dan Price, America's favorite CEO, Dan Price, also says unfettered capitalism gave us the empty store shelves they warned us would happen under socialism, and so on and so on. So I want to do another year in review, talk about whether or not we have unfettered, unregulated capitalism. So I know a lot of people might immediately say, well, of course not. We have institutions like the Federal Reserve, the Department of Education, the FDA, the EPA, so on and so on. Have all these, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission. We have antitrust laws. We have redistribution programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all that fun stuff. So do we have unfettered, unregulated capitalism?
Yeah, to the no, yeah, to the no, to the no, no, no.
But that's really just scratching the surface. In fact, I forgot about this gem from July of 2021. Someone tweeted this oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, trying to blame it on unfettered capitalism. And then it turned out, a lot of people pointed this out, that, you might say, well, of course it is. It's probably some greedy oil company like ExxonMobil or BP or Chevron, one of these big, greedy, big oil corporations. But then as it turns out, this particular disaster was a consequence of the nationalized oil company in Mexico. So,
whoopsie daisy.
A lot of people talk as if we have unfettered, unregulated capitalism. And I don't know where to start by just talking about this year alone, 2021. Actually, I want to start with a funny story. This happened. This was reported in the LA Times in June of 2021 about how the state of California is offering $100 million to rescue its struggling legal marijuana industry. And you got to wonder, what's the deal? State of California, they legalize marijuana? Like, what's going on? Is there just a shortage of customers? Are just nobody in the state of California wants to buy and consume marijuana products, cannabis? Is that what's going on? California, of all states, of all places? As it turns out, according to this LA Times article, many cannabis growers, retailers, and manufacturers have struggled to make the transition from a provisional temporary license to a permanent one renewed on an annual basis, a process that requires a costly, complicated, and time-consuming review of the negative environmental effects involved in a business and a plan for reducing those harms. Going on to say, supporters of legalization blame the discrepancy on problems that they say include high taxes on licensed businesses, burdensome regulations, and the decision about 3/4 of cities in California not to allow cannabis retailers in their jurisdictions. I find the high taxes part amusing because a lot of progressives hijacked the issue of cannabis legalization over the last decade. Because there is a legitimate point about, we don't think people should be arrested for merely having, shards of a plant in a plastic bag in their pocket. That's ridiculous. But then, of course, progressives, fascists, like they do, they jump on this issue. They try to make another wealth redistribution scheme like, well, maybe we should just, make it legal so that we can tax and regulate it and use it to raise taxes to give to schools and stuff. Yeah! And they've screwed it up so badly in California that they've made it so expensive to produce and consume cannabis that we now have to give them $100 million rescue. Way to go, guys. That's California politics for you. But let's jump to another issue. This is a bigger issue, becoming a bigger concern, and that is COVID testing. This is becoming a hot issue over the last few weeks because COVID tests, they're hard to find, they're expensive, and some may wonder, why is this the case? Why are they expensive? Why are they hard to find? A lot of people will try to blame unfettered, unregulated capitalism. They'll try to blame things like big pharma. Woo! And here's a study from ProPublica: why rapid COVID tests are so expensive and hard to find. It's a pretty long story, but if you scroll down right here, it talks about how the FDA has been particularly circumspect with more novel approaches to testing, such as an olfactory test that detects the common COVID-19 symptom of loss of smell. The agency's reviewer deprioritized an application for a scratch and sniff card, even though it had been proven to stem transmission, said inventor Derek Tumray, a professor at the Yale School of Medicine. Other companies, big and small, have been tripped up by FDA demands that seem minor in view of the urgency of the situation.
No surprise there.
For example, the biopharmaceutical giant Roche told ProPublica that it submitted a home test in early 2021, but it was rejected by the FDA because the trials had been done partly in Europe.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
The test had compared favorably with Abbott's rapid test and received European Union approval in June. The company plans to resubmit an application by the end of the year. A smaller company, which did not want to be named because it has other contracts with the United States government, withdrew its pre-application for a rapid antigen test with integrated smartphone-based reporting because it heard its trial data from India, collected as the Delta variant was surging there, would not be accepted. Doing the trials in the United States would have cost millions of dollars. Going on to say the FDA reviewer who quit this May described what the delays look like from the inside. With a background in virology, he could evaluate the hundreds of pages in an application within a few days, but then something strange happened. The applications would go nowhere for months as higher up officials seemed paralyzed by indecision. Another story in NBC News titled, "Why do COVID rapid tests cost so much even after Biden's push for lower prices?" Another long story, if you scroll down here, it talks about how more than 30 antigen tests have been developed in the United States, but just 6 companies have authorization from the Food and Drug Administration for over-the-counter use. No rapid tests have full FDA approval. 2 rapid molecular options made by Lucira Health and Q Health also have emergency use authorization. Quote, unfortunately, many submissions are incomplete or contain insufficient information for the FDA to determine that they meet the statutory criteria, FDA spokesperson James McKinney said. The agency has taken a stricter stance than its European counterparts. Maybe that's a reason why tests are easier to find in some European countries. In June, the FDA warned people to stop using Innova Medical Group's rapid antigen test, saying the agency had significant concerns that the performance of the test had not been adequately established. Yet, in the United Kingdom, which has contracts worth billions of dollars with the California company, the regulatory agency okayed the product. In Germany, regulators have been given special authorization to dozens of antigen tests. As long as these tests are regulated as medical devices, the FDA has to regulate them, not as critical public health tools, but as medical tools with all of the onerous clinical trials that slow everything down 100-fold.
No surprise there.
There's a lot to say about the issue of COVID testing. I've talked about this before. I think I talked about this in my last year's review. I also talked about it in my FDA video back in August. And we see that this is an ongoing issue, that the FDA is slowing down the industry on COVID testing. No big deal or anything, though. Speaking of COVID, it can be very easy to forget how much of a disaster the vaccine rollouts were in 2021. I remember reading many times early in January of this year about how difficult it was in places like New York City to schedule a vaccination. According to multiple sources, senior citizens had to answer a 51-step online questionnaire just to get an appointment scheduled. According to a couple blue check marks here on Twitter, as you can see, from January of this year. There were also stories, according to NBC News, that thousands of COVID vaccines were winding up in the garbage because of federal and state guidelines. Because when the vaccines first came out, they were supposed to be reserved for a very select group of people, like people in high-risk categories, healthcare workers, so on and so on. And so you would think, well, if these vaccines are about to expire, why not just give them out to anyone who wants them? There's only one problem with that. Some people did try to, and they lost their job and faced criminal charges, like this doctor from Houston, Texas, Dr. Hassan Gokul, who, when he had some vaccines, I think he had 10 vaccines that were about to expire. He called up some friends and family, said, hey, who wants a vaccine? Hooked them up, and then he lost his job and faced criminal charges for violating the guidelines involving the vaccines. Again, guys, more unfettered, unregulated capitalism. Meanwhile, we had to wait until about March of this year for the FDA to approve the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They approved the 2 mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna in December of 2020. But Johnson & Johnson, we had to wait a little bit for that one. And even after Johnson & Johnson's vaccine got approved, you had mayors in cities like Detroit turning away thousands of doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because it's not as effective as Pfizer and Moderna.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
Of course, then Johnson & Johnson got a pause by the FDA, probably made some people more skeptical of the vaccine than before. Meanwhile, the sitting president, jibber-jabbering Joe Biden, was blaming Facebook and social media companies for deaths, for misinformation. And while that was going on, you had the press secretary, Jen Psaki, talking about how the White House was working with Facebook to flag misinformation, and people were starting to wonder, whoa, is there collusion between big tech and the White House? Maybe. Maybe it's also the case that companies like Facebook are obligated to work with government regulators in the White House because they're under constant pressure from organizations like the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department because they're constantly under scrutiny, antitrust, as we can see right here. FTC alleges Facebook resorted to illegal buyer-berry scheme to crush competition after string of failed attempts. This is from August of this year. Again, guys, more unfettered, unregulated capitalism.
Blow it out your ass.
And then, of course, on top of all this, we had a crappy vaccine rollout. We had mayors in large cities turning away the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the FDA waiting forever to approve these vaccines and then putting a pause on them. Doctors getting arrested for giving away free vaccines. And we're told that these vaccines are so wonderful. You know, thank goodness for these scientists who worked on their vaccines that the government essentially told them, hey, nice intellectual property. I think I'll take it.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
When Biden was trying to waive vaccine patents, because apparently that's going to make everything better. It's weird because we had journalists like Amy Siskin last year in 2020 talking about, freaking out about Trump potentially trying to twist the arm of the FDA to greenlight the vaccines faster. And he's going to get people killed. Well, you got to wonder how many people died because they did not have access to vaccines sooner because we had to wait for the FDA to greenlight them. And then she turned around and talked about, oh, these vaccines are so wonderful. They're so important. This is like the whole attitude of regulators on this issue, that we had to wait for regulators, politicians, bureaucrats to greenlight these vaccines. And then they came with all these strings attached. The rollouts were a total disaster. And then within a year, they're trying to force it on everyone through the Department of Labor by changing the OSHA regulations to mandate that employers with over 100 employees mandate that every worker get vaccinated. This happened a lot at the local level. You had San Francisco shutting down businesses like In-N-Out for not enforcing the vaccine mandate. Got to wonder how many people lost their job because of this. Again, guys, more unfettered, unregulated capitalism. Recently in New York City, police arrested people for protesting the vaccine mandates that Burger King was supposed to honor. This all sound like unfettered, unregulated capitalism to you guys?
Yeah, to the no, yeah, to the no, to the no, no, no.
But again, that's just vaccines. Let's move on to energy policy. Energy policy. We had as soon as January, Joe Biden was trying to cancel. He canceled the Keystone XL pipeline permit. And as Alex Epstein points out on his website, energytalkingpoints.com, he made a whole article talking about skyrocketing oil and gasoline prices. And he talks about how just the threats of anti-fossil fuel politicians over the last decade have led to a state where fossil fuel investment is down by over 50%. Less investment means less supply, means higher prices. But Alex specifically talks about how anti-oil politicians' restrictions on infrastructure, especially pipelines, have reduced the supply of oil by making it difficult or impossible to transport United States oil to international markets. If not for these restrictions, we'd be producing more oil with lower prices for everyone. The dynamic U.S. oil industry could be rapidly increasing production to take advantage of higher prices, but thanks to anti-oil politicians' threats to oil investors and infrastructure opposition, the U.S. is ramping up production more slowly than OPEC. You can see this with the halting of the Keystone XL pipeline permits. Also, President Biden, he had a 60-day moratorium on new oil and natural gas leases and drilling permits in places like New Mexico. Here in the great state of California, you have Governor goofy-ass Gavin Newsom announced in April of this year a halt. He wants to phase out oil extraction in California, and this will start with the halting of fracking permits by 2024. Also, don't forget he signed a bill that will outlaw gas-powered vehicles in the state of California by 2035. Not just California, though. We also have New York, the state of New York, the new governor shut down or stopped new natural gas projects in New York State. Now, of course, you see AOC has been on this crusade for a while, apparently, according to the New York Post. And now when New York residents, over the next few years, when their energy bills are higher than they should be, you're probably going to see politicians like AOC, instead of blaming this on a lack of energy supply and a lack of energy production, you're probably going to see her blame unfettered, unregulated capitalism.
Right now, when we have this no holds barred, Wild West hyper capitalism.
Blow it out your ass.
We also had people like Brianna Wu tweeting stuff this year saying that libertarians designed Texas's energy system, free market competition, unregulated, and it's working well. And, she's referring to the Texas energy crisis from earlier this year. I did a whole video on this when it happened, debunking the myth that it was deregulation in Texas's energy, when quite the contrary over the last 2 decades. And this is Republican politicians, by the way, like George W. Bush, Rick Perry, Greg Abbott, who have been on a mission to impose wind energy mandates in the state of Texas. Governor Abbott even bragged about it last year, about how Texas's energy, they get a lot of their energy from wind. And now, as a consequence, the Texas energy grid is very vulnerable. It's unreliable. They've avoided nuclear energy. They've been shutting down coal and natural gas power plants, and now they pay some of the highest rates in the United States. They've basically embraced the Denmark and Germany strategy. I just read the other day that Germany is going to shut down 3 more nuclear power plants. Yeah, I'm sure that will make everything better for you guys. Way to go. More unfettered, unregulated capitalism. Apparently, cities in California are also banning the use of gas in commercial kitchens and new residential buildings. Oakland has already put this in effect, which is raising the cost of building new projects in these large cities. Meanwhile, California is trying to shut down its last nuclear power plant, not opening any new nuclear power plants. And you got to wonder if electricity rates are about to go up in the state of California because of its hostility toward fossil fuel and nuclear energy, and they're mandating that businesses and homes switch to electric rather than gas heating. How much is this going to have an impact on consumer prices at places like restaurants? Also, I guess Gavin Newsom signed a bill to ban the sale of gas-powered leaf blowers and other small engine equipment. Apparently, it's leaf blowers that are really responsible for climate change. Now let's move on to housing policy. You guys remember when the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and I would say this is arguably a proper function of government. I'm not anti-CDC, but the CDC did something that caused a lot of people to scratch their heads. They issued an eviction moratorium. Now, of course, I think this was challenged in the Supreme Court and got denied, but what business is the CDC, an institution for regulating disease and controlling diseases, preventing the spread of diseases, educating the public on diseases and how to take care of yourself? What does it have to do with housing and rent and evictions? Of course, then you might also say, well, we have a Federal Reserve, so of course there's no... we have a highly regulated industry because the financial industry is heavily regulated when it comes to borrowing money for mortgages and housing. Of course, housing prices are up, I think partly due to the Federal Reserve's low rock bottom interest rates that stimulated demand in there. Now some people are speculating that the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates in 2022, causing borrowing costs to go up higher. And that's the beauty of central planning. That's the beauty of an institution like the Federal Reserve is no matter what decision it makes, brings interest rates down, brings them up, it's going to send distortions throughout the economy. Remember, guys, unfettered, unregulated capitalism. I guess I remember Politico tweeted earlier this year in July that Biden's move to fire top U.S. mortgage regulator is triggering calls from fellow Democrats to use the agency to expand access to loans for lower income people who have struggled to buy homes since the financial crisis. And apparently this is being echoed in bills like Build Back Better. Has not got passed yet, but apparently they're trying to. Where have we seen this before? Where didn't the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, didn't they make it a mission to find ways to use regulatory agencies to make it easier for low-income people to buy homes? And how did that turn out, huh?
That's just not smart.
Of course, it's a lot more than merely moving around some money, a few $100 billion here and there to low-income people. A lot of the housing problems in America have to do with restrictions on supply, namely in places like San Francisco that imposed fines on developers to the tune of $1.2 million for building too many units.
That's just not smart.
Gee, I wonder why housing prices in places like the Bay Area are through the fucking roof right now. According to one source, it's illegal to build new homes in over 70% of San Francisco. I did a whole video on this back in August about how this is largely a result of the California Environmental Quality Act. But to make matters worse, the Biden administration, this is according to NPR, so not exactly Fox News or The Blaze or any of these stupid right-wing news websites. This is NPR writing stories just a few weeks ago. Why is the Biden administration increasing the cost of building new houses? And they wrote this in response to the Biden administration's plan to more than double import taxes on softwood lumber from places like Canada. And softwood lumber is crucial material to build new houses, and levying a large tax on imports only hurts the cause by expanding housing supply.
That's just not smart.
Of course, then we get into the issue of international trade, which Biden, you can maybe say, is a little better than Trump on. I wouldn't say by much. According to Neoliberal, the American seafood company is being fined $350 million by the United States government for violating the Jones Act. More unfettered, unregulated capitalism, guys.
Right now, when we have this no-holds-barred, Wild West hyper-capitalism.
Know your role and shut your mouth!
Why did the American seafood company get fined $350 million? Because they took a fake 100-foot railway that takes advantage of a loophole in the Jones Act that allows goods shipped on a Canadian railway to be exempt from the act. They literally would ship the frozen fish from Alaska to New Brunswick, Canada, put the shipping containers on the 100-foot train line, and then drive the fish over the border to Maine. It took 9 years for the United States government to catch them, and apparently they have to pay a price for that. Thank goodness for the Jones Act. And then there was this thread from October of this year talking about how the port situation in California is caused by truck driver shortages that are caused by both the California truck ban from 2011 and the AB5 law, which has made it more difficult for truckers to work as private contractors in the state of California. The website PolitiFact did a fact check on this, and I would actually agree that it's more complicated than just trucker shortages and AB5, especially considering that AB5 keeps bouncing between the levels of the judiciary, still being worked out. But the article does agree that this is a regulation that might be having some impact. This policy has been on the books since 2008. Some trucking companies have used the regulations to pressure drivers to buy newer rigs, and some in the industry have claimed that, while not necessarily the cause of the backlog, this kind of policy certainly does not help.
No surprise there.
And I would argue that this is a situation where it's really hard to calculate the consequences, because if it's been on the books for nearly a decade, it's really hard to tell how many people would have went into trucking in a place like California if not for this regulation to begin with. Anyway, that was housing and international trade. Let's move on to other business regulations. According to Scott Lincecum, back in June of 2021, he tweeted, Colorado passed a law requiring companies to advertising remote work to disclose a job's expected salary. Many companies have responded by no longer hiring people from Colorado. This does remind me of back in 2020 when they passed AB5 and then Uber and Lyft were threatening to just pull out of California altogether. You had state legislators like Lorena Gonzalez being all disappointed and surprised. I thought they would just abide by the new law.
Blow it out your ass.
Way to go. I mentioned this in a recent video about how the Biden administration is proposing to give tax credits for electric vehicles, but only specific electric vehicles, ones that are made by unionized automakers. Apparently, they think climate change is this big fucking emergency that we need to freak out about. But when it comes to subsidizing electric vehicles, you see, climate change is only going to be prevented so long as we give kickbacks and favors to organized labor. The Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, defended this decision. And then I saw this Twitter thread, and there's actually a news article from the San Francisco Chronicle. The problem is I would read this article, but it's behind a paywall, you guys. So I got to rely on a Twitter thread to get the information. Talks about how a noodle shop tried to open in San Francisco this year. $50,000 to pay for the lease, cooking equipment, and furniture. $3,600 per month to pay for rent plus utilities. $100,000 in the hole, and it's still not open.
No surprise there.
Why? First, an anonymous caller phoned into 311 and reported the noodle shop owners were doing work without a permit. Not true. They had simply disconnected a sink to work a bathroom tile and light fixture. An inspector ordered the work to stop. They then filed for new permitting, sending the same information 5 times. Every step they were handed off to different people in the city government with different instructions. Nobody could give me a straight answer for anything. Next, the city started mandating the restaurant use new equipment. The city required ventilation hoods when only induction cooktops were necessary. It also mandated they have twice as many sinks as workers. That was expensive. Cooking noodles in a microwave seemed more feasible. Finally saying government micromanagement is one of the reasons our small businesses are suffering so much, especially in places like San Francisco. And then San Francisco has been also dealing with more looting and shoplifting. My buddy Sean, the actual Justice Warrior, did a whole video on this back in June. Highly recommend you guys check that out, about how the one thing the government should be doing when protecting individual rights and property rights, the one thing it should be doing, it's doing less of in places like California. And as a consequence, businesses are more vulnerable to looting and shoplifting. And then I mentioned this in a recent video too, about how Chris Sacca, he has this whole thread about how he tried to give He tried to invest $25 million into giving low-income people, poor neighborhoods in San Francisco, free internet. I talked about this in my net neutrality review video. You don't see much outrage over someone like Chris Sacca trying to give away free internet access, is nearly as much fervor over net neutrality getting repealed. But apparently the city of San Francisco stopped Chris Sacca from giving poor people free internet access in San Francisco. Again, all capitalism's fault, you guys. And then the state of California also mandated gender-neutral toy aisles for large retailers. This does not seem like a big deal, big fuss to me. Seems like, doing something without really doing anything. I'm sure it's going to make retailers more vulnerable to frivolous lawsuits in states like California in the future. Dallas Airport, they were bragging about how they took $100,000 from a passenger's luggage. Yeah, I guess in the Ayn Rand paradise of unfettered, unregulated capitalism, Gulch, police can just seize $100,000 of your money if you're not accused of a crime. This also happened, California, I think it was Los Angeles, they voted for hero pay. They mandated hero pay for grocery store workers. And as a consequence, grocery stores like Kroger, who I just read recently, their profit margins are actually smaller this year than they were in 2020. They're down to like 2.5%. And I saw that in response to Elizabeth Warren's claims that the reason why prices are through the roof is because of greedy corporations, big greedy grocery store monopolies like Ralph's and Kroger, jacking up prices so that they can increase their profits when the fact is their profit margins are lower than in previous years. But Kroger decided to close 3 stores in Los Angeles and I think 2 in Long Beach because these particular locations were not profitable with the mandated hero pay. So I guess it's better to not have any jobs than to get exploited, you guys. And then, of course, we have Republican governors like Ron DeSantis going after big tech. This is a big issue an ongoing issue I have with Ron DeSantis. He gets praised. I think you can rightfully praise him for refusing to do lockdowns and mask mandates in places like Florida, but then he takes it too far by prohibiting businesses like cruise liners from having vaccine requirements. And now he's going after big tech. And I'm sure if he finds his way to the White House in 2024, he's probably going to be as hostile, if not more hostile, than Democrats are toward companies like big tech. And it also doesn't help that a lot of conservative cheerleaders like clueless Candace Owens say things like that Big Pharma, she said this just the other day, Big Pharma is the greatest evil on the face of the planet. Big Pharma, bigger evil than the Ayatollah, the clerical regime in Iran, bigger evil than commie goon Kim Jong-un, bigger evil than Vladimir Putin, bigger evil than the Saud royal family, bigger evil than the socialist knuckleheads who run Venezuela and Cuba. Big Pharma is the greatest evil. Now, the argument to this is, well, clueless Candace Owens, she's not a politician, she's just a commentator, but I think a lot of commentators, they plant the seeds for future politicians who agree with them. So this is probably going to get worse. You're going to see Republicans be less of a voice, less advocates for free markets in capitalism when they have this hostile attitude toward corporations like big tech and big pharma. Finally, there's education spending. This is kind of in line with the whole unfettered, unregulated capitalism thing. Corey DeAngelis tweeted back in April in response to the Philadelphia Inquirer saying that state lawmakers have dramatically reduced state funding for public schools over the last generation. And he corrected this by showing how public education spending in Pennsylvania has just gone nowhere but up. In 1990, it was $10,000 per student. In 2000, it was $12,000 per student. Now it's $18,000 per student. That's probably going to go up with Biden's American Rescue Plan, which gave over $100 billion for public education spending. And this is the thing with public education, is spending just keeps going up and up and up. And when the quality of the education does not improve. In fact, I have a prediction. All this new education spending, public education spending, you're probably not going to see a major improvement in the quality of education over the next 5 years. And when we don't, you're going to see a lot of politicians, you're going to see a lot of commentators talking about how it's a lack of funding. How education has been defunded when the fact is it just keeps going nowhere but up. Anyway, I'm sure I'm missing out on a lot of examples of how we don't have unfettered, unregulated capitalism. We're going to see what impact these new multi-trillion-dollar spending packages like the American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act have. Just want to say Happy New Year, everyone, and hopefully the capitalism we experience in 2022 is even more unfettered and unregulated than this year.